may not.
I see some students, but I won't single them out.
Oh, not here.
No, there, I see them in our list. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Houston Colloquium in Judaic Studies to our first lecture in the spring series. We're very delighted to have with us Dr. Yom Tov Assis, an associate professor of Jewish history at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And the reason that he's here is not only to entertain us here at Rice and educate us, but also because he's the Corbett Scholar in Residence of the Jewish Community Center this year. We're very delighted that the Jewish Community Center agreed to lend him to us for the meeting. Dr. Assis was educated in England and in Israel. He is the author of numerous publications. I'll cite two of his books in particular and then just say a few things about the nature of his research. He's the author of The Golden Age of Aragonese Jewry and the author of The Jews in the Crown of Aragon, Economy and Community. His work has focused primarily on the social, political, and economic history of Jews living in the Iberian Peninsula and in Provence. He is really a pioneer, one of the people who, more than anybody else, is combining the use of both Hebrew and Latin and vernacular sources and trying to reconstruct the history or the histories of the Jews living in this region. He's going to talk with us today. His talk today is on the topic Sephardi apostasy and Ashkenazi martyrdom, facts and myths.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Ladies and gentlemen, I am also pleased to be at Rice University. This is my second visit in 1 week, I believe. My first visit was in the framework of LEN. When I didn't choose, of course, the subject, I suggested this topic as one of the possibilities, and I imagined somebody here at Rice University decided that this is the appropriate topic. Ashkenazi martyrdom and Sephardic apostasy, facts and myth speak for itself. In the course of the past 20, 25 years, almost practically half of my life, I've spent analyzing, studying the history of the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, in southern France. I have come more and more to realize how certain myths were perpetuated from one generation of scholars to another generation. And the greatest of the historians of Spanish Jewry, Yitzhak Beer, I'm very proud to be the disciple of his disciple. I have to state categorically that I have not found yet any research on the history of the Jews in Spain more solid and more authoritative than Beer's work. I have also to admit, to confess that all the discoveries in inverted commas I was fortunate to find in various archives in Spain showed me again and again that I was unable really to revolutionize the history of the Jews in Spain as presented by this great historian of Spanish Jewry. And yet, Beer, until he decided to switch from medieval Jewish history to the Second Temple period, he devoted all his research and all his life to the history of the Jews in Spain. His head was certainly immersed in Judeo-Spanish history. He studied the archives and worked on Hebrew sources, but his heart was not in Spain. His heart was in Ashkenaz. He was a great admirer of the Jewish community north of the Pyrenees, in Franco-Germany, comparing it to the Jews of Spain, whose history is studied thoroughly. I think again and again, probably without saying it openly, he showed his admiration, his appreciation of that Jewry north of the Pyrenees, so pure and authentic and traditional and loyal and faithful and everything. Compared to the history of the Jews or to the Jewish community in Spain, that was sophisticated, perplexed, immersed in between various strengths, torn apart by different philosophies and schools of thought. Bear indeed was very critical of the community whose history he has actually written with such great devotion and dedication and expertise. If we read the history of the Jews in Christian Spain by Behr, I think the conclusion really is inescapable that Behr thought that Spanish Jewry brought upon itself the disaster with which its long history ended in 1492. One cannot but reach the inescapable conclusion of Behr, reading his book, that in fact of all the trends and all the schools of thought and loyalties and affinities of various Jews in Spain from the beginning of the Reconquista period, because he really devoted himself to the Jews in Christian Spain, right until 1492, it was that trend of Spanish Jewry that was most closest to Ashkenazi Jewry, whose affinity was really Franco-German Jewry that in the long run proved to be the right one. In the long struggle from the 13th century onwards, it was after all what the traditionalists and the mystics claimed was that which was true. This is one aspect in the history of the Jews of Spain that I would like to raise in the, as much as it is possible in the framework, in the time available, in the framework of one lecture. I would also like to suggest that reading the history of the Jews in Christian Spain by Behr leaves one perplexed, because where were the yeshivot, the study of the Torah? Because really this is one of the branches that he has simply left out. Of course, unless somebody knows that there were such academies and such yeshivot, one would have believed that there was nothing of the sort in the Iberian Peninsula compared to what was going on north of the Pyrenees in Franco-Germany. For he devotes practically nothing to this aspect of Jewish intellectual and religious life. Several brief chapters are devoted to various personalities such as Rabbi Yonah Gerondi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, Barcelona, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, but he was after all a Jew from Ashkenaz who came to save Spanish Jewry from their religious perplexities. But when also we read Behr's book, we also come to certain conclusions that Spanish Jewry prepared itself to apostasy in 1391, when very tragic massacres occurred as a result of an anti-Jewish propaganda that was led by an anti-Jew, the Archdeacon of Écija near Seville, Ferran Martinez. In 1391, massacres everywhere in Spain, the whole peninsula, entire Jewish communities were destroyed, and a very large number of Jews killed, but also an equal number of Jews now became converts to Christianity. And Baer, following the critics of Spanish Jewry on the eve of the 1391 massacres, he seems to have agreed with those critics of the post-1391 era that Spanish Jewry, or Jews of Spain, who now became conversos, new Christians, Cristianos Nuevos, were in fact the product of a certain religious atmosphere that was created in Spain, a result of a loose religious life, laxity in religious in religious observance, and that, of course, would not have happened this way north of the Pyrenees in Franco Germany, where the Jews would have sanctified the name of God as they had done in 1096 when the Crusaders attacked the communities in the Rhine. This is even if they are not said things clearly, they are implied by the presentation of Baer, and I repeat, the greatest of all the historians who dealt with the history of the Jews in Spain. But other historians also devoted time and attention to the Jews of Spain. And I am so puzzled by the way a certain historian like Cecil Roth, who wrote about the Marranos of Spain, presented a certain idealized, in inverted commas, history of the Marranos, of the Conversos. And his book, translated also into Spanish, until this very day has been read by many thousands of people who read his chapter on the religion of the Marranos, and have come to the right conclusion on the basis of his book that the Conversos were Jewish, that the Conversos were the Jews who kept the Jewish religion in secretly and outwardly had no choice but to act as Catholics. And yet, in an article that he wrote later, that appeared in Hebrew, and I doubt whether any of those who read his book on the Marranos outside Israel read his article in which he completely changed his mind. When he says, and I quote, "The unusual became almost the usual, from the Visigothic persecutions to the Almohads, from 1391 massacres to the Tortosa disputation, from the expulsion from Spain to the general conversion in Portugal. Conversos in the Iberian Peninsula occupied the Inquisition during 300 years, and later he said, I've changed my mind about the Marranos. When I said that the Marranos were actually crypto Jews and kept Judaism and were persecuted by the Inquisition, I changed my mind." He did not write, unfortunately, a revised edition of the book, and I'm not very sure that everybody who read his first version would have read the second anyway. But that is what he said. Now, when we read Baer's book, he has one single sentence in favor of the Conversos. When he says approximately something like this, I cannot quote by heart word for word, he says that the Conversos are Jewish and linked by bonds of faith and destiny with the Jewish people. Approximately such a sentence he says in his book on the Jews of Christian Spain. And based on this sentence, my teacher, Professor Weimar, wrote dozens of articles and many books on the conversos, on the life of the conversos. According to Weimar, the Inquisition was quite right. The Inquisition that persecuted the Cristianos Nuevos, the new Christians, the conversos, was right in its central major assumption that they were Jewish and therefore Judaizing, practicing Judaism in secret, and therefore had every right to persecute the Jews because the terms of references of the Inquisition was that it eradicates heresy from among the Christians. And there were, of course, baptized people. So this is the Professor Netanyahu's view on this matter is quite well known. He claimed that all the Jews who converted in 1391 were those Jews who were not interested in Judaism, were estranged from Judaism. It was a wonderful opportunity for many of them to become Christians. They were not Jewish. Those who wanted to remain Jewish were either killed or they remained Jewish. And one cannot and should not view the history of the conversos in any way as part of the history of the Jews. If they were not integrated within Christian society, it was because of the bigotry of Christian society that did not accept them. It was not because the conversos wanted to remain a group apart, separated from Christian society, but the Christians did not integrate them, did not absorb them, and the Inquisition, if there was any sign that you can see, you can find of these conversos or their descendants of returning to some Jewish practices, it was because the Inquisition turned their lives into hell and made them actually think twice before they continued to lead a Christian life or a secretive Jewish life. This is what Netanyahu claims. The various historians and sources that I can quote, the conversos remained loyal to their father's faith, loyal to the covenant of the God of Israel. And now Cecil Roth, whom I quoted earlier, he quotes Abraham Zakut of the 15th century, the time of the expulsion. And he was describing Rabbi Yehuda, a descendant of Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, known as the Rosh, who was the disciple of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, one of the greatest rabbinic authorities of Ashkenaz or Germany in the 13th century. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel the Rosh came to Toledo, where he settled as a rabbi with his family and children. It is now clear that neither the Rosh nor his descendants, his children, actually deviated from Ashkenazi practice, and they were convinced that their views and traditions, which they brought from Ashkenaz, were the right ones anywhere and any time, that there was a clash between Ashkenaz and Sepharad. It is clear, as his children also say, that they had the correct and proper and better tradition to which they wanted to stick. And so, Cecil Roth, when he tells us about the 1391 massacres, he brings the story of the death as a martyr of one of the descendants of Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. And he shows how in Toledo, if there was a martyr, if there was somebody who sanctified the name of God, it was a Jew of Ashkenazi origin. Somehow Cecil Roth forgot to mention other Jews, the son of Chasdai Crescas, who also died as a martyr in Barcelona. And I could quote other sons of other rabbis who were not necessarily of Ashkenazi origin. But somehow, I don't know if it is conveniently or really because he was not aware that there were other Jews who were also killed because they were Jewish in 1391, and nobody at the time doubted the sincerity of their Jewish faith, their attachment and their loyalty to Judaism and to the Jewish people. In fact, we have here contradictory reports. Rabbis who speak about Kiddush Hashem and other reports from the post-1391 period, which somehow they're often quoted by so many historians, of the criticism leveled against that generation of sinners, of those who were trained in the rationalist tradition, and so that when the time of test came, they would not be able to survive, to remain Jewish, or be able to have the spiritual strength to sacrifice their lives and sanctify the name of God. I think that the time has come to suggest that if I want to know about the behavior of certain Jews who belong, let us say, to the rationalist trend in Jewry that developed ever since the period under Islam, but continued to develop in the 13th century and in the 14th century, that if I want to know about their attachment to Judaism and their loyalty to Judaism and their ideas about Judaism, that one should not go to the books written by the anti-rationalists who level their criticism against these people. I suggest that if I want to write a history of those who belong to a certain trend, that it is not a proper thing to do to go to the books and tractates written by their opponents. And if I analyze the list of all those who became apostates before 1391 and were converted during the 1391 massacres and after the massacres, I wonder whether we are in a position to give the exact definition, identity, every of these apostates, whether they were all the product of the so-called rationalist Judaism, the product of the Judeo-Muslim period in Spain. Or whether we would find among those converts some, God forbid, who might have studied in their younger days Talmud in the Tosafist method, and some others who might have even been the disciples of a Kabbalistic school in one place or another in Spain, whether in Catalonia or in Castile. Has anyone really checked the identity of all the converts, of all the apostates who were apostate before 1391, and checked the list of all those who converted? It is not easy. When again some of the historians speak, they often say something about Portugal, but they're a bit hesitant about Portugal. They say, well, in Portugal, maybe some slight changes and so on. An anonymous story is quoted by one scholar about the Portuguese conversos who did not sanctify the name of God. Well, now, let us go back to the period 1492 and see who were these Portuguese who did not sanctify the name of God. When the decision by the Catholic monarchs was taken that the Jews should be expelled from Spain unless they would convert to Christianity, And they were given enough time, in medieval terms, to think and be ready in due course. Circumstances and conditions at the time were extremely difficult. Practically no European country in the West would have agreed to take them because they had expelled them anyway. Not long beforehand, England and France and other countries got rid of their Jews. Certainly they would not accept now Spanish Jews. North Africa, we have terrible stories about the destiny of Jews who decided to go to North Africa and settle there, although enough Jews from Spain settled in Morocco to change the character of this community in due course and make it Sephardi. Very few people actually were allowed in some of the Italian states. Very few in the first instance in the years following 1492. Now, we all know that the Ottoman Empire opened its gates, but I have found no records in Spain of the awareness of the Jews that somebody, the Sultan Bayezid II, was prepared to accept any Jew in Spain, because none of them saw this on television, and they did not read the newspapers, and they were not given any news on the radio. One should check whether Jews in Calatayud, in Huesca, in various parts, distant, isolated communities, in Heracles, or whatever, that they heard about that Turk, the Muslim infidel in the East who was prepared to take them, and if they did hear about it, whether it was possible for them to find the ways and means to reach a port and find a captain and find a ship to take them. In short, things were not as easy as one might imagine. So, the majority of the Jews of Spain who decided to remain Jewish and therefore abandon their homes, sometimes their families, their business and everything, could go where? To the nearest possible country, Portugal. And I am not here going to waste time suggesting how many Jews crossed the border from Castile to Portugal. Whether there were 80,000 or 40,000 or 50,000 or 120,000. It's immaterial. There is no doubt about it that the majority of the Jews in Spain who decided to leave and not apostatize, they were the ones who went to Portugal. And it is interesting that Cecil Roth speaks of the expulsion of the Portuguese Jews, but there was no expulsion. They talked about a possible expulsion, but no expulsion took place. And it is well known what happened to the Jews of Spain in Portugal. Now they were the majority of the Jews living in Portugal. And these people were Mekadsheh Hashem Barabim. They sanctified the name of God. They did not have to die because the Catholic monarch did not tell them either stay here or die. You stay here, you get out, they got out. This is a Kiddush Hashem. They left everything behind and went to Portugal. When in the Portuguese king wanted to marry the princess of the Catholic monarchs, the daughter of the Catholic monarchs, and he was asked to expel the Jews as a condition to marry their daughter. And he said yes, but he changed his mind. And he said, why should I get rid of them? I'm not going to follow in the footsteps of my would-be, of my fathers or my in-laws to be. He did something else, much cleverer, he thought. He just brought the Jews in this main square, many of them, and sprinkled a few waters on their heads, and he said, you're all Christians now. He did not ask their opinion, and they were all now converts to Christianity. This is what happened to these Jews. It was not a question of, I'm going to force you, to take you by force to the baptismal to the church. There was no such an act. It was a declaration that all Jews who lived in Portugal, from now on, they were Christians. I suggest that anyone who sees in these Jews, originally from Spain, now living in Portugal, and constituting the bulk of Spanish Jewry, who left Spain because they did not want to be Christian, but now they were forced to be. I suggest that these Jews, under no circumstances, could be really compared to other Jews who sanctified the name of God, but they failed to do so. I suggest that this is not a proper, correct view of their behavior. When we read Abravanel, that great philosopher and scholar and statesman who had the possibility to remain in the Iberian Peninsula but left, while other colleagues of his, like Abraham Senior, remained. In his commentary on Ezekiel, he says, and I'm just translating this for the moment, excuse my translation. He says, although they and their descendants tried very hard to become like the Gentiles and be absorbed in Gentile society, that will not happen. For they will always call them Jewish. And they will always claim they're behaving as Jews in secret. Quoting, and of course he says, "Uvaesh sarot yisrefu otam al zeh," and they will burn in fire because of this. Quoting this commentary of Abravanel, many suggest that here we have a man like Abravanel who knew his people. He was in Castile, he was in Portugal, he knew. And here what he's telling us, that these people are not really Jewish. Those who make them Jewish, as Professor Netanyahu said, yes, the Gentiles who claim that they were Jewish, that they were practicing Judaism, and they will burn them. Are they really martyrs? Are they really Mekatsheh Hashem? The problem is that here, I had no time to show it because I am now on my first piece of paper, and I have here about 10, so I don't imagine I will have time to prove the point. But I think anyone can select any kind of source from the time to prove anything one likes to prove. And in reality, to really not pursue this format, because I'm not going to quote again and again. In fact, in reality, one has to come to the conclusion that the conversos of 1391 certainly were not all made of the same dialect. Converso community was not a homogeneous community. They were among those who were converted under duress or because of fear. There were those who really remained Jewish, not only in spirit, but also in practice. There were those who were so hopeless now, just desperate, that they tried to find their way, possibly, to live as Christians. Not because they had wanted to be Christians, but now that this happened, they will try to see if they could survive like this. There were others, surely, who were, in any case, very much estranged from Jewish tradition, and they were not so great believers, and they will now be Christians, and they will not be great believers in Christianity. It's not difficult for a heretical Jew to become a heretical Christian. And there were some, it appears, the sources indicate very clearly that they had debated in their heart for a long time, that there were some who were in doubt for years and years. Some, we know, they converted just before 1391 without knowing that any massacre was going to take place. Some others, well, finally decided that it's time now to convert. They had their doubts, and finally they came to the conclusion, now we become a Christian. And they were some. So that now just talking about the four possible categories shows that we are not talking about one type of convert, that there are various types, and that everybody could find support for his view by analyzing the ideas that, of these people after their conversion. The Jews, of course, who left Spain and settled in the East, in Muslim lands, particularly in the Ottoman Empire, they were the ones who decided not to remain in Spain and remain Jewish. And I don't think there is any argument about their loyalty to Judaism. The problem, of course, is not. The problem arises when we discuss the future generations of conversos, of people who had converted either in 1391 or in 1492, and their descendants now would re-establish Jewish communities in the south of France, in the Netherlands, in England, and some even in the New World. However, now, what was the identity of these people? 100 years sometimes, 150 years would pass before such descendants of such converts would return to Judaism. And the question, of course, that arises, why did these people of converso origin decide to go to Bordeaux or Bayonne, or Rouen, or Antwerp, or Amsterdam? And why did they not go to the East? And the impression that is given is often their return to Judaism seems to be at a time when in some countries it was more advantageous and less hazardous to be Jewish than to be Catholic. This includes not only Catholic France at the time, but certainly Protestant Holland and Anglican England. So there are doubts. Why did they not go to Salonika? Why did they not go even to Venice? Why did they not go to Safed? And I suggest that again we should see things in the proper perspective and realize that we have here a variety of people from various trains, the descendants of several generations of the actual conversion, people who had no idea what Judaism was all about anyway. A certain religion that was considered by many of these people who returned to Judaism, let's call it Marianism, a certain religion that was considered Judaism, but that it was not really Judaism that we know elsewhere in the world, that there's no doubt about it. That some of the rabbis, in inverted commas, of the conversos on the day of Kippur on various occasions when they gave sermons, they quoted even the Apocrypha because they thought it was part of the Hebrew Bible, because they could only utilize the Bibles that were available in Spain. So that there is no doubt about it, there is no continuity of Judaism as one knew it in the 15th, 16th centuries among those who were now detached from centers of Jewish life elsewhere in the world. And therefore that their return to Judaism would not be in the way a person who lived as a Jew, or even a scholar who sees things in Jewish history in a certain way, of course, they were not going to act in accordance with his expectations, because they were not at all sure what the Judaism beyond the borders of the Spanish Empire actually consisted of, and they did not know. And yet, some people who did come from the territories of the idol worship, as these were called, the Iberian Peninsula, like David Nieto, for example, in his Mate Dan, when he says, And as our fathers did and still do until this very day, those who are our flesh and blood in Spain and Portugal who continue to stick to the Jewish faith. So there are various authorities that one could quote in order to show that even people who came from that part of the world, he was the Chacham in Amsterdam and at the time when he said it. There is no doubt about it that the consideration of many of later age conversos to remain in the Iberian Peninsula or to cross the border and return openly to Judaism were economic considerations. That is true. And one wonders, how can one explain the identity of a person like Daniel Levi de Barrios, who was already a Jew in the Amsterdam community, and yet he found no contradiction in joining the Spanish army and become an officer with the name Miguel de Barrios at the same time. And he was the official poet of the Amsterdam community when he composed verses on various occasions. He was also an ardent supporter of Shabbatai Tzvi. Roth asks, do we have here the answer to the Sabbatean conversions? And when in 1618 many conversos who returned to Madrid after having been outside Spain were burned, a scholar asks, how can you claim that they were martyrs? Why did they return? Why did they return to Spain? And what about the Takana, the ordinance of the Amsterdam community and other communities against all those Jews who now reverted to Judaism but still continue to go back and forward to Spain? And they returned to Spain and Portugal. By the way, this is possibly the explanation for the so-called legendary ban on Jews visiting Spain. There was no need for any ban because a Jew who went to Spain would have had his head chopped off anyway. I had good intentions of analyzing with you some of the ideas of among the Ashkenazi authorities concerning Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of the name of God, and to see in what way these differ from Spain. But I think that we cannot do it. What I will try to do is to offer some kind of a unprepared concluding remarks so that I can finish on time. And that is I will try to show some of the absurdities, in my opinion, that happened in. We know very well that Maimonides, for example, one of the authorities followed by many in Spain, in his Igeret Hashmaz, although in Mishneh Torah he slightly changed, he was rather liberal from the point of view of those who claim that Ashkenazi Jews developed a certain idea of Kiddush Hashem, which was beyond what the Judaism had ever expected, that the readiness of a person to commit suicide and kill even his dear ones rather than submit to baptism. And yet I think things are not very, very clear here, because immediately after 1492 we have more and more evidence that Jews who left Spain were actually deeply influenced by an idea of a Kiddush Hashem, sanctification in the name of God, that does not fall in its intensity than any Kiddush Hashem that we know in Franco-Germany in previous times. I'm not only suggesting that Rabbi Yosef Karo, who longed to be a monk, who wanted to be killed, he said it. I'm talking about others. Maybe I have time to quote, I know that there is a need for some questions and comments by the maybe I can quote one or two. Ibn Verga, who expressed great admiration for the Ashkenazi Jews who were martyrs, who were prepared to die for the sake of their faith. And he's quoted again and again by those who wanted to show that in Spain the Jews were not so. I cannot understand how they failed to see that in the writings of the same Ibn Verga, passages in which he tells us about those in Spain who were ready to sacrifice their lives. It is interesting that those scholars who could not, but quote Ibn Verga, these passages, they were really honest scholars who had to quote them, they said Ibn Verga exaggerated. But why did Ibn Verga exaggerate in one and not the other? I really don't know. Rabbi Yosef Yarbetz and others, Rabbi Abraham Saban, he talks about the Portuguese Jews in a different way than some of the scholars of the 20th century. He said, like the Hasmoneans of old, were prepared to die. Zot HaTorah, he says, this is the law, Asher Telamdum, that you will have to teach, Sheyamutu al Kedushat Shemo. This is the spirit that will die for the sanctification of his name. This is what he says, the spirit that prevailed among the Jews in Portugal. And many Jews in 1497-98 were actually killed. And I am wondering at the wonder of some of the scholars who said, how did they behave? They were killed, many of them. What happened to the Jews who came from Spain and settled elsewhere? If we analyze their writings in 16th century Safed, various steps that were taken, in fact, in order to comply with their idea of a chiper ad amo, that there is a need here to repent in the proper manner in order that the process will be complete. And steps were taken in order to reach this point. Where did this idea come from? Where did they bring it from? Did they learn it in the communities where they settled? They did not have it beforehand? When mitzvat aseh lekadesh et Hashem yitbarach, and one of the authorities he added, Inyan su lehamir dato, which is not found neither in Mishneh Torah of Maimonides, nor in the Tur of Rabbi Yaakov ben Arosh, and nor in Rabbi Yosef Karo's. He said, if they compel him to change his religion, he should die. Of course, Al-Kabetz also, Rabbi Shlomo Levi Al-Kabetz, who is well known to us, his famous hymn, Lechadodi, he wrote, he who believes with a perfect and pure faith should sanctify the name and be ready to die rather than transgress even a minor commandment, mitzvah tanah, in his Ahim. And since I have no time to quote Moshe Al-Sheikh and David Zimra and others, I would like to complete just one sentence. Recently, Professor Katz, one of the most eminent historians alive today in Jewish history, wrote an article comparing the Jews in times of massacres in 1096 and 1648-49. Tatnut and that is one in the Crusade period in the Rhineland, the others in Eastern Europe, and the Khmelnytsky massacres. And he came to the conclusion that the spirit of Kiddush Hashem, which has become so famous of Jews of Ashkenaz, did not appear in Eastern Europe. What was his possible conclusion? His very cautious, however, his suggestion for an understanding of the process, he said, possibly they were influenced by the Jews from Spain. Which is, in my opinion, an amazing twist, that wherever there is a possibility to see something that is not in complete agreement with your idea, that you can always have somebody to blame. And therefore, whatever the circumstances and the developments, the Jews of Spain, even those who left the Iberian Peninsula, remain responsible for all the failures, even not of themselves and their children, but also of those pure, authentic Ashkenazi Jews who failed to sanctify the name of God in Eastern Europe at the time. And last but not least, when they say, oh, how can we explain all the Sabbatians, the Dolmens, who were converted to Islam? Only by reminding you of what the Jews of Spain did. Of course, forgetting that those Jews who became now Muslims were the very Jews whose ancestors decided to leave Spain to remain Jewish. And of course, conveniently we forget that in Catholic Poland, Jews who followed Jacob Frank and all his he were acted not very differently than those of Spain. Thank you.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions.
I have 2 or 3 questions. Small ones. One is a technical question. I wanted to know regarding the use of the term Kiddush Hashem. You mentioned something early on in your talk that implied that the term Kiddush Hashem could be used or was used not only for martyrdom but for Jews who willingly left the country rather than convert. The first part of the question is, do you have any textual evidence that that phrase, which usually implies martyrdom, was used for Jews who willingly left rather than converted? That's number one. The second question is to bring up a more general question, to bring up a couple of different components of the differences between Spain and Germany that we didn't address, and just to get your opinion on it. Number one is the messianic idea that existed in Spain at that time, and how that could influence or justify the conversio's decision, living as they thought at the end of, or at the beginning of the Millennium era. And the second one is the very different attitudes towards Christianity among Spanish Jews and German Jews. The notion of Christianity as idolatry started to really fall apart at that time, and Nathan Ibn is probably the most famous historian of that. So therefore, for the Spanish Jew who didn't necessarily believe that Christianity was idolatry, the justification of converting, or at least falsely converting, would be more in line with Maimonides' Epistle to Yemen, where he allowed the Jews of Yemen to claim, to claim allegiance to Muhammad because it wasn't idolatry. So the apostasy in Germany was an apostasy to Christianity, which was idolatry, and therefore it goes back to the Talmudic Yared Lo Yavor, die rather than transgress. Whereas in Christianity in Spain, I think it was maybe a little more nuanced.
I don't know the chapter would allow me to answer all the questions asked, but I think your questions are sort of the relevant questions really show the very weakness of my fact of the decision not to submit to Catholicism. I used it, and you said which authorities have used it. I am the authority used it. But it means I am sorry that I have maybe misled anyone into thinking that the use of Kiddush Hashem by me is my probably enthusiastic approach to the act of these Jews misled. I did not intend to say that there were sources that attributed the idea of Kiddush Hashem, the term Kiddush Hashem, to these people. I have judged it appropriate to say that the description that we have of the destiny of the people who left Spain, even in Verga, when he tells us about what happened to the people, and he put into the mouth of one of his personalities there the famous words addressed to God, Ribon HaOlamim, of God said, you are trying everything in your power to make me change my religion, but Al-Korchan Shel Shamayim, he said, and he said, I will not do so. I think when I meant Kiddush Hashem, these people who did what they did, I meant it in my own very subjective interpretation of their act. As for their very pertinent claim that it is possible that the Christians the Jews in Spain no longer considered Christianity as Avodah Zarah, and in accordance with Maimonides, they could have taken an easier approach to the possible conversion. I beg to differ really seriously. Although what you said about the Meiri is primarily brought by Katz, in my opinion, in exaggerated terms, I have no evidence to really support this idea that the Jews in Spain at the time considered Christianity in a drastically different manner as a result of a certain process, possibly that started at the time of Meiri. And I think that is showing me that.
Because we understood a few words there in the back, but we didn't quite know exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you, I'm sorry. Will you be comfortable here?
Yeah, I'd be fine.
Right, I think it's 1:30, isn't it? Exactly, right. Well, good afternoon. I came all the way from Jerusalem to tell you about the Judeo-Spanish culture of the Eastern Sephardim. Well, I suggest that I'll talk about the subject for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then if there are any questions, any comments that you have, because it's from 1:30 to 2:30 our session now, all right? And just make sure that... That's the time I was meant to start speaking. I'll repeat this. Okay. Right. What I was saying is this, that 1 hour session, and if I see that there are no comments or questions, of course, we will add a few words. This is not a subject that can be treated properly in 1 hour, but I don't know if any one of you has any background, has read anything about the subject, but I have to suppose that people have not done anything. So anybody who has information on the subject might find some of what I say repetition. I hope, however, that I am right, that most of you never read or heard anything about the subject, and in any case I hope I will put it in a different way than the way you heard. Now the title, The Judeo-Spanish Culture of the Eastern Sephardim, speaks for itself. I am talking here about the cultural tradition of a branch of Jewry that emerged after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 and settled in the eastern part of the Mediterranean basin. I'm not talking about the Jews from Spain who had settled later in Western European countries and in America, because as you will see, they did not have this tradition that I am talking about, Judeo-Spanish. In 1492, when the Catholic monarchs decided to expel the Jews, the tens of thousands of Jews who decided not to baptize but to leave the country had very little choice. Let's allow people to see something. I was saying that the Jews of Spain who were expelled in 1492 had little choice where to go, because most countries in Europe were close to Jewish immigration. In North Africa there was great political instability which did not allow the settlement of many Jews. Italy was not a very hospitable country, although it was not a united country. There were several thousands of Jews from Spain settled, but the bulk of the Jews who left Spain, there were two branches, there were two directions, or three, let us say three. One is in Morocco, despite all the difficulties, the problems. They settled in Morocco. There, they changed the character of the Jewish community in Morocco completely, because Moroccan Jewry became a Sephardi community. Those who had lived in Morocco before their arrival were influenced deeply by the newcomers, and eventually Moroccan Jewry, all in all, became really a Sephardi community. The second direction which the Jews of Spain could take was Portugal. And the bulk of the Jews in Spain chose Portugal because of its proximity to Spain. It was the easiest country to reach. It was not a very hospitable country to the Jews, because the King of Portugal decided first to allow rich Jews from Spain to settle, and for obvious reasons, and those who were not wealthy were allowed to enter the country only after they had paid a certain sum of money, and their stay in the country was limited to a certain period. However, just to make, to cut the story short, the Jews of Spain who settled in Portugal 5 years later had to choose between baptism and expulsion. Before they chose, however, the King of Portugal decided to baptize them all. While they were waiting supposedly for boats to take them wherever they wanted, the King of Portugal gave orders that some water to be sprinkled over their heads, and thus the Jews of Portugal, tens of thousands of Jews at the time in Portugal, became converts despite themselves. And so we have the largest part of Spanish Jewry trapped in Portugal for several generations, some of whom are until this very day in Portugal, of course, descendants of Jews. We have found remnants of their Jewish past in some of their practices. There are Catholics today, but they do have several practices. For example, they light candles on the eve of Sabbath in a closed cupboard. This is the area, anybody who knows Portugal, is the Belmonte area in the north and some other villages. Some have been returning to Judaism, but the bulk of them, of course, are Portuguese Catholics who know that they are of Christian descent. I think you will find there are seats here. Right. Now what happened? Yes.
Did any of the Jews who stayed in Portugal who got sprinkled with the water continue to practice Judaism?
In secret? Yes, of course. And for generations to come, in fact, there was a continuation of Jewish life in secret. That is why the Inquisition was very, very active, and hundreds, if not thousands of Jews, in fact, were burned in auto-da-fe in the 16th, 17th, and even the 18th century. The Inquisition in Portugal acted very harshly with these people, and let us not forget that unlike those Jews who decided to remain in Spain,
The Marranos, you mean?
yes,
Yes.
but they decided to remain in Spain knowing that they had to be baptized. The Jews who left Spain and settled in Portugal intended to remain Jewish, and they had no choice but to become now Catholic. Therefore, secretly they continued their Jewish practices. But the story that I am telling is not the story of the Marranos in Portugal or in Spain. It is just an introductory remark, just to realize that the bulk of the Jews who left Spain were trapped as secret Jews, as Catholics, new Christians, Cristianos Nuevos, in Portugal. Now, the rest of the Jews of Spain who left the Iberian Peninsula chose the eastern direction, and they were in fact heading, they were heading eastwards to the only country that openly accepted Jewish immigrants. It was primarily for economic reasons that the Ottoman Turks decided to allow the Jews of Spain to settle in Ottoman Turkey. Now, it is their story that I am trying to tell. These people who settled under Ottoman Turkey, and Ottoman Turkey at the time controlled large parts of the Balkans, today's ex-Yugoslavia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and of course Turkey proper, Syria, Lebanon, the land of Israel, and Egypt after 1516, 1517. So this is a large empire where the Jews would settle, and they settled in their masses. Now the Jews of Spain, prior to the period we are discussing, when they lived in the Iberian Peninsula, they went through a very right.
It's immigration.
Here there are seats. Please, if you can sit down, we can. Right. So, now, let's continue. saying that we have to understand that the Jews of Spain, in the course of the 5, 6, 7 centuries that preceded the expulsion, underwent a linguistic, cultural, religious transformation, very, very serious one. And that is due to the fact that in the Iberian Peninsula there was a very long war called the Reconquista in Spanish historiography, when the Christians began the reconquest process of reconquering Spain, and this continued from almost the 8th, 9th centuries until the 15th centuries. While the Christians in the north were conquering, were advancing southwards, adding territories to the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, Aragon, Castile, Portugal, Navarre, the Jews, of course, were passing from one cultural framework into another one, from one linguistic area to another. They had mastered the Arabic language, they had lived under Islam, and now that the Christians controlled large parts of the Iberian Peninsula, they had to learn Latin and Romance languages, that is Spanish, Catalan, etc. Now, this, of course, was not an easy task, but it has also contributed a lot to the Jews' ability to adapt themselves to new conditions, to various cultural and linguistic changes that they were going to encounter in their history later on. Now, I think it is fair to say that we only have 4, 5 chairs. And you can have this one. I think now we are pretty full up, and I think we should not. Yeah. No, I know, but I'll tell you, there is a chair because there's no longer chairs, there are 2 chairs. That's all. Right. Now, the Jews of Spain, of all Christian lands that we know, are the only people, only Jews who use the language of the country for purposes other than daily speech. Now, in no land in Christian Europe did the Jews who knew the languages, whether French, Provençal, English, German, in no country in the Middle Ages did the Jews use the language of the country for any purpose except their daily speech. They did not produce works in French or in Provençal or in English or in German. They used Hebrew, and of course they spoke the languages. The Jews of Spain are the only exceptions, together with Italy later on, that who used Spanish even for in literature. They produced some works in addition to their works in Hebrew. And even in those days, in the pre-expulsion period, today we use the word to denote the use of the Romance languages in Hebrew characters, al-Khamiado. Al-Khamiado in modern Spanish means the use of a Romance language, either Castilian, Portuguese, Catalan, etc., in Hebrew characters. And the word comes from the word al-Khama, which is the word in Spanish for community. It is originally from Arabic, but it is used in medieval Spanish to designate the Jewish community, the Kehillah of the Jews. And al-Khamiado, so they used Romance, they used Spanish, or Gallego, or Catalan, or Navarrese, etc., but using Hebrew characters. We have a lot of documents written in Romance languages. Romance languages are all the vulgar languages that developed from medieval Latin into what we know today: Spanish, Catalan, Gallego, Aragonese dialect and so on. And they used it. However, apart from that, we know also of several Jews who were very important contributors to the Spanish medieval literature, like Santo de Carrión. Santo is the word for Shem Tov in Hebrew, and Santo de Carrión is the one who wrote what we call the Proverbios Morales, for those of you who know Spanish, Proverbios Morales, who are studied until this very day in Spain as a classical work of great importance, and several other people, I don't think I have time to mention, have contributed not little to medieval Spanish literature or Catalan literature. But now, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, we should have expected that they should produce a kind of a hostile reaction on the part of the Jews. That is to say, the Jews of Spain who were expelled in 1492, there is not a single reason that we can really think of on the spur of a moment to justify why the Jews of Spain should continue to use the Spanish language. Now, I don't know whether you know, but probably many of you do know, that the Jews of Spain who settled in the east, in Istanbul, Constantinople, in Salonika, in Sarajevo, in various cities of the Balkans, Bulgaria, Romania, Bosnia, Serbia, Greece, Turkey, of course, Syria, Egypt, Israel, Safed and Jerusalem particularly. All these Jews continued to use the Spanish language. And the Spanish language that is used by these Jews continued to be their mother tongue until the 20th century, until our own days. How is it possible to explain such a phenomenon? The Jews of Spain were kicked out by the Catholic monarchs. There was no reason why these Jews should be really such great lovers of Spanish culture or of the Spanish language. Why did they not adopt immediately Turkish, Greek, any Slavonic language in the Balkans or Arabic in the countries where they settled? Why did they continue to use the Spanish language in a non-Hispanic environment? In a Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Slavonic environment, they were in fact, paradoxically, the bearers of Hispanic culture, the ambassadors of Spanish culture in the Middle East. And this is for generations. I'll tell you just an episode to illustrate this from the 18th century. In Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, one day we are told, according to an account which is a reliable account, in the Jewish quarter of Balat in the south of Istanbul, Turkish people came running to the Jewish quarter, shouting, "Oh, your navy has arrived." They told the Jews, "Your navy has arrived." The Jews, of course, were shocked. As far as the Jews knew, there was no Jewish navy anywhere in the world. Right. And so they started running to the port. They started running to the port in Istanbul, and they suddenly saw what? The boats, of course, came from Spain to visit Turkey. Now that's interesting, because Turkish ordinary people working in the port, they heard the Spanish language spoken by the people, by Spaniards, Christian Spaniards in the 18th century, and identified the sound of Spanish with the sound of Judeo-Spanish that they hear among the Jews of Turkey. Which is, of course, significant. It shows that despite all the differences that I'm going to talk about between Judeo-Spanish and Spanish as it developed in Spain, nevertheless, for the ear of an ordinary Turk, the two languages were the same, and therefore they came with the news that the Jewish navy arrived for a visit in Istanbul. All right, I'll allow just 1 or 2 minutes of questions and remarks.
Oh, whenever
what is Ladino?
Oh, yes, okay, I'll answer this in a moment. It is part, what I'm going to say will explain. Yes, please?
Oh, I was just gonna say, Ladino.
Right, Ladino, I will speak about it in a moment.
Why are the Jews from places like Iraq are included into the Sephardic,
They do not.
while there are no Sephardic groups either?
Right, I will explain that as well.
Have there been any explanations that come even reasonably close to being logical as to why they did
Yes.
hold on to the
Yes.
Spanish
Yes.
language?
My explanation. Now,
Just the whole
do you hear the explanation?
I mean,
I will explain. Okay? I will explain. Well, maybe I changed my mind. Maybe not to, we don't have questions now. Let's continue because most of the questions you are asking, in fact, are to be answered. And we'll leave the questions, as I said, to the very end because we have very little time left. 1/2 hour to tell you the story of 500 years. So, not so much, right. But what happened is that in 1492, with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, the unexpected occurred. The Jews of Spain, according to our logic, should have been miserable people, desperate people who had been now expelled from their homes, their businesses gone. They were not allowed to take money with them or anything of value. They must have been, according to our understanding of things, very desperate people. And instead, from 1492 onwards, from the time they were expelled until we meet them in various communities in the Middle East, we see here people with determination to succeed in their new countries, with people with hope and faith that they are going to build their new lives, and which they did in various countries in a matter of 5 to 10 years. We see not a desperate, miserable bunch of people, but we see a very flourishing cultural and religious revival throughout the communities where these Spanish refugees settled. And I'm not going to talk about this religious and cultural revival, but it is sufficient, for example, to tell you that the Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Yosef Karo was written just a few years after the expulsion, that a very important school of mysticism was established in Tzfat, in Safed, in northern Israel, that the number of books that were printed, and that printing, of course, was available then, newly were printed was, etc., etc. But we have now to answer the question, why did the Jews of Spain continue to use the Spanish language, the language of a country that was so nasty with them? Why did they see to it that they continued with a tradition, with a culture, with a language of a country for which they should have had no good feelings whatsoever? Nowadays, you see many Spaniards, particularly experts of medieval Spanish and of medieval Spanish history, impressed so much by this Sephardi tradition that retained the Spanish language, and they present it to the world as if this is the outcome of a love that the Jews of Spain had for Spain. There is nothing further than the truth. This is not at all the explanation. The Jews of Spain had no reason to remain in love with Spain. But the explanation that I am going to offer is twofold. There are two aspects. One, the Jews of Spain never thought that the Spanish language belonged to the Catholic Spaniards. They had contributed no less to the development of Spanish proportionately than anyone else in the Iberian Peninsula. They were there as a body, as an ethnic and religious group for more than 1,500 years. While the Hispanic tribes and peoples were changing affinities, faith, religion, languages from pagan Roman period to Christianity and then to Islam and backwards then to Catholicism, the only group that remained stable and constant and faithful to its own tradition were the Jews. Because you do not imagine that the Muslims and the Christians in Spain really changed because there was an immigration of Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula to Spain or of Christians from north of the Pyrenees. It was basically the people, the same people and their descendants who changed constantly their affinity, their affiliation, their loyalties. The Jews were there all the time from pagan times, antiquity, until their expulsion. And when they left Spain, they had every reason to believe that they were expelled from their home, even a home that is much more a home for them than it was for any other group, including those who expelled them. And the Spanish language, they felt it was no less theirs. They lived with it, they contributed to it, etc., etc. Now, this is one reason. The other reason why they continue to speak Spanish is that these Jews of Spain, like the Jews of Germany, who emigrated eastwards, they also felt a certain superiority to any of the people among whom they lived and the Jews whom they met. When they arrived in the east, in Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, ex-Yugoslavia, all the territory of ex-Yugoslavia, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, etc., they found Jews. They found Greek-speaking Jews, what we call the Romagnots. They found there Ashkenazi Jews, Italian Jews, French Jews, many Jewish communities. The bulk of the Jews were the Greek-speaking Jews of the Byzantine period, and the others, the Arabic-speaking Jews in Syria, Iraq, and so on. They felt that they were far superior. I'm not saying that they were, but that's what they felt. And therefore they thought that they would not mix and that they would retain their identity, their Sephardi identity, by continuing to speak the Spanish language, which would distinguish them from their Jewish, new Jewish neighbors. But no less than that, also, they never felt any kind of great reverence and respect for the languages that now were spoken in the environment where they settled, whether it was Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Bulgarian, or any language. They thought that they had a culture superior. It is only when Jews felt that they continued with their language. That's why I said on other occasions when people heard me that Yiddish and Ladino, and by the way, Ladino is Judeo-Spanish, despite what some scholars really confuse the people by distinguishing between the two, Ladino, Judeo-Spanish is the same. And what I say is that they're very similar to what happened with Yiddish, with people who migrated eastwards from Central Europe to Eastern Europe. They felt that they were superior to the people among whom they lived, whether Poles, Ukrainians, or all the other masses. They thought that they were the elite, and of course, to show that they did not belong to these people, they continued with a language that developed into Yiddish. The same happened with these Ladino-speaking Jews, vis-a-vis the Jews among whom that they met, and vis-a-vis the people, Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Bulgarians, and Slavs, among whom they lived. This is really very basically the answer to the question. But it is interesting that they identified the Spanish language they spoke with everything that was Jewish. What was in the Iberian Peninsula an instrument of acculturation, of linguistic assimilation, in the East, where the Spanish language was not spoken by anyone but themselves, became now the sign of Jewish identity. Now, what is the meaning of the word Yiddish? What is the meaning of the word? Jewish. The same word was used by the Ladino-speaking people. They called their language often in the sources from the 16th century onwards, Judaism. Judaism. That is Yiddish. In Spanish, Judaism. Jewish. Now, there was something indeed Jewish, not only because it was spoken by the Jews, but because it was written in Hebrew characters, like Yiddish. They wrote it in Hebrew characters all along until 1928. We'll see what happened in 1928. Now, so they called it Judaismo, Ladino, Spanish, etc. and they wrote it with Hebrew characters. But now you can see, however, that there was now the beginning of a development of a new language. Why? Because while medieval Spanish was developing in its own course in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, the natural way any language developed, whether in England, in France, Germany, etc., the Jews, they took the medieval Spanish with them to a non-Hispanic environment, and there they continued to speak it and write it. But of course, the development of Judeo-Spanish could no longer be the same as medieval Spanish in Spain. And therefore, their path, of course, parted, the differences grew bigger and bigger, and there were very unique developments in the grammatical forms of Judeo-Spanish, the simplification of Spanish. For those of you who know Spanish, then, for example, Ladino does not have the subjunctive at all. Yes, they do not use it. They simplified the thing, and some other characteristics that are found only in Judeo-Spanish and not in Spanish. And I'll just tell you an anecdote very briefly to illustrate how interesting the development of Ladino was. My very first visits to Spain, and I do not come from a Ladino-speaking family, despite my Sephardi origin, my wife does. And I said to my wife that before I studied really enough Spanish, I said to her, look, my first or second visit, I said, you better speak to the person. We were going to a shop. You better speak, you know Ladino. You speak. And we were in a village in northern Catalonia. So she began to speak about a minute or two, asking him a few things. And then he stopped. He said, Madam, why do you insist in speaking to me in medieval Spanish? It appears that the man was a Catalan who lost his job under Franco regime. He was an intellectual. He was an expert, actually, in Catalan, not in Spanish, but he knew well enough medieval Spanish in order to think that what she was speaking to him was not actually in Spanish, certainly not modern Spanish, but he identified it with medieval Spanish, and he was right, because there are certain words that have been retained from medieval Spain. Yes? For example, the word meldar in Ladino, which means to study, to read, it doesn't exist in modern Spanish. Right? Pardon?
That's an estudiar.
Of course, yeah, yes, yeah. But meldar in Judeo-Spanish comes from an original, and of course pronunciation as well. For example, the word tobaja that is in Ladino, in Spanish today is toalla and not tobaja. Yes? So there are things, unless you know, you know. So here we are with a new language developing, which is a Romance language, certainly belonging to the family of Spanish Romance languages, but it is distinct, it is different. There were, of course, dialects in the Oriental dialect of Ladino and the Western dialect. The Oriental dialect was in Istanbul, Bursa, Edirne, Izmir, in the whole of the place that today fall under in Turkish territory, whereas the Western one is Salonika, Sarajevo, all the parts that in the Balkans, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. Now, the question is why we do not find Ladino in certain parts of the Arab world, like Iraq and Syria, Egypt, and so on. First of all, it is not completely true. It is not true. I speak Judeo-Arabic, that is the Arabic of a community in an Arab country. And I never knew until I arrived in a Ladino-speaking community that several words that we use in our Arabic, in fact, are not Arabic at all. That's why I call it Judeo-Arabic. Because no Arab would understand when I say kavasal. No Arab would understand when I say tobaja. No Arab would understand when I say korasha, etc. These are words from Ladino. So how do we account for them? How do we explain them? In those places where the Sephardi Jews, the Spanish Jews came in big masses, sooner or later they dominated the local Jews and imposed their language. Not every Ladino speaker Jew is of Spanish origin. You find a Jew who is called, say, Ashkenazi. He is actually of Ashkenazi origin, but he's Sephardi and he speaks Ladino. And you find a Jew who is Sephardi today, is called Mizrahi, but he is not of Mizrahi means Oriental. He is of Byzantine origin, Greek-speaking origin, but he speaks Ladino. What happened? In Istanbul, in Salonika, in Sarajevo, in Bursa, in Edirne, the Spanish-speaking Jews eventually imposed their language on the local Jews. The entire Jewish community in Turkey, Greece, etc., apart from one or two, Yanina remained Greek-speaking. Chalkis in Greece remained. Why? Because very few Sephardi Jews arrived there. But in every place where the majority was Ladino-speaking, everybody eventually accepted the Spanish language. What happened in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Baghdad, in Alexandria? There were people who came and spoke Ladino. And I remember in the 17th century or beginning of the 18th, a Spaniard was taken captive in Syria. And he wrote in his memoirs about an interesting story. He was redeemed by Jews in Aleppo. And he was invited to spend Shabbat with them. He was not a Jew, of course, he was from the Spaniard. And he is telling us in his memoirs that he was invited to this Spanish-speaking family. And he was shocked, in the beginning of the 18th century, he was shocked to hear around the table on Saturday the people speaking Spanish. And the head of the family spoke to him about Spanish literature of the 16th and 17th centuries. You can ask, of course, how does a Jew in Aleppo, Spanish-speaking, know about the literature of Spain in the 16th, 17th century? Now that's very interesting, because there were constant immigrants of Marrano origin who fled Spain and who came to the east and rejoined the Jews. And they came, of course, with the new development of the Spanish literature, and they acquainted their brethren, the Jews, with the new literary products of Spain. Now, therefore, even in places like Aleppo, Alexandria, Damascus, Beirut, where in the 20th century we think there was no Ladino, there was Ladino. Until the beginning of the 20th century, there were families, Silvera and Pichotto, and obviously Laniado, Jewish families from Spain, who continued the tradition of Spanish. But the Mustaribun, that is the Arabic-speaking Jews, were the majority. And in the end, of course, they prevailed. And Ladino never became the language of the entire community. Iraq certainly is the obvious example where very few Jews from Spain arrived. And therefore, there was never a place that developed Ladino. I will leave you about 10 minutes for questions and marks. Now, did this language develop into anything but a spoken language or just written language for daily usage? It did. It has produced its own literature. Its own literature. First of all, from the 16th century onwards, we find the translations of the Bible and the prayers. We find, for example, the Bible, Psalms. In Constantinople in 1540, a translation of the Psalms into Ladino. The Torah was translated in Constantinople in 1547. The prophets were translated in Salonika in 1572. The whole Bible was translated into Spanish in the 18th century in Constantinople by Abraham Asa. That's the entire Bible. Several dictionaries and glossaries were produced in the course between the 16th and the 18th centuries. And great classical works of Spanish Jewry written originally either in Arabic or in Hebrew were translated into Spanish. For those of you who are acquainted with this literature, just mention very quickly, Bahia ibn Takuda's Chovot al-Levavot, or the Duties of the Heart, was translated into Ladino. Ishaq Abu Av, Menorat HaMaor, was translated into Ladino. Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch was translated into Ladino in a shortened form. And some works were written originally in Ladino. I think one who deserves to be mentioned is Moses Almosnino. Moses Almosnino wrote books in original Ladino. Regimento de la Vida, he produced in 1564. He wrote several books, all in Ladino. Perfect Ladino. Perfect Ladino, it means that in real good style, nice sound of Ladino. Abraham Assa, whom I mentioned earlier as a translator of the entire Bible, he wrote several works in original Ladino. But most important of all is what you have today in English translation is the Me'am Lo'ez. Me'am Lo'ez was originally written in Ladino. It was initiated by Jacob Coury. And it is a huge encyclopedic work that was translated into Hebrew, and in recent years there is an English translation as well. This is an encyclopedic work that contains, we can say, a thesaurus of Sephardi culture. Everything that the Sephardi Jews had by way of commentaries, of stories on the Bible. It is as if it's a running commentary on the Bible, but it's in reality, it's an encyclopedia of learning, trying to teach the people everything that the man knew. He could not finish, of course, such a great work. It was continued later by people after his death, and it is available, even in English, for anyone to check and see what kind of work it was produced. Then, of course, there was literature, simple literature. The Koplas de Yosefat Tzadik that Sephardi Jews read on Purim, for example, by Abraham de Toledo in 1732. And of course, the most important of all, the Romanceros. The Romanceros is something had nothing to do with the Jews. These are ballads, these are songs, these are stories that the Jews of Spain, the Sephardi Jews from Spain, continued to sing and recite for centuries to come. In Spain, they forgot them. They disappeared. And so, in the 20th century, in the late 19th century, in the 20th century, experts of medieval Spanish who realized that something of the medieval Spanish ballads are retained, are preserved, not in Spain, but in the East, in Salonika, in Istanbul, in Bursa, in Izmir. They had to go all the way to listen to this, to these romanceros that are also available. It is important to note that Judaism or Ladino is not only a language which was used everywhere, in the market, at home, in the yeshiva, in the synagogue. In the 20th century, the streets of all the Jewish quarters throughout Turkey and Greece until the Holocaust, of course, Salonika had a Jewish majority. Turks and Greeks had to learn Ladino because of the majority in Salonika until the 20th century was Jewish, and they all spoke Ladino. I promised to leave 10 minutes for comments and questions, and therefore I would like to now tell you about the end of Ladino. Ladino suffered a very serious setback in the 19th century. It was not because Ottoman Turkey decided to impose the Turkish language, or that in Arab countries they decided to impose Arabic language, or etc., etc. No. It was because Jewish organizations whose origin was in Central and Western Europe decided to educate their brethren in the East. This is, of course, the patronizing attitude of Jews who believed that they achieved excellence in cultural level. But primarily I am referring to two organizations, one in Germany called Ezra, and the other one is the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Paris. in Alliance Israélite Universelle, of course, created a network of schools from Morocco to Tehran. Why? Because the Jews of France, who were now newly emancipated, who thought of themselves, of course, they have achieved the highest cultural level, decided to elevate their brethren in the primitive East to their own level. How did they do that? By really creating excellent schools, but in every sense except in the Jewish sense. Because in the Alliance Israélite Universelle, children studied French history. They knew about les Gaulois, Vercingétorix, etc. They learned the geography of France that they had never visited, but they knew everything, the north of France and the south of France and the climate in France and everything. And of course the French language. The French language. Jews now in the East, in Salonika, in Istanbul, in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Beirut, in Sarajevo, everywhere, they began to think, those who were now the product of the Alliance, in French. They no longer wanted to speak Spanish, they wanted to speak French, the language of Voltaire and of Molière, of Racine. And there is now a kind of an elite of an aristocracy that started with French, left Ladino. Ladino remained now the lower classes and the traditionalists who opposed any kind of assimilation. Now, soon afterwards, there was another setback, because with the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, it lost the war, of course, and there were now new countries that emerged on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, like modern Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and all the Balkan countries, as well as Arab lands, Syria, etc. There, of course, the national language became a criterion to check the loyalty of the Jews as well. And so Greeks expected the Jews in Athens to speak Greek. The Turks expected the Jews in Turkey to speak Turkish, etc. And there was a movement in the 20th century of Jews who were prepared to speak Turkish or Greek, etc., in order to become part of society at large. So modernists, on one hand, who primarily spoke French, and other local patriots, or Jewish patriots who wanted to speak Turkish or Greek, etc., who remained speaking the Ladino language, those for whom Jewish tradition remained an essential part of their life. I remember until the 70s, the 60s and 70s, where there was an emphasis by those who stood for traditional Judaism to speak on purpose, all the time, everywhere, Ladino. Whereas the others were ashamed of this, and they wanted either to speak Turkish in Turkey or French and other languages. There is now a return to Ladino. In Turkey I see a little, but of course the communities dwindled and lost a lot of their power because huge part of the Jews, I'm not talking about Greeks because they were unfortunately exterminated by the Nazis, as well as some of the parts of the Balkans, but in Turkey and other parts they emigrated primarily to Israel, and some, of course, to this country, to France, Belgium, Mexico, and so on. In Seattle, there is a Ladino-speaking, very strong community. But, of course, in the new environment, the continuation of the Ladino language or the survival of the Ladino language is difficult. How can in Israel, for example, a group of Ladino speakers continue when the children have to come and study Hebrew in the schools? And so on, and particularly that unlike the Yiddish-speaking, very ultra-Orthodox who retain their own traditional framework of schools, the Sephardi Jews did not opt for that. And therefore, today Ladino, still it is heard on the radio in Israel every day. Still there is a newspaper in Israel as well as in several other parts, in Belgium, in Istanbul, in several places. And of course, we have in universities in Israel, including my university, the Hebrew University or Bar Ilan University, where Ladino is being taught on an academic level for further research and investigation. Right, thank you. Now, a few minutes for questions and comments. So let us see how many accordingly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, let's start this way.
What is the relationship of Israel and Spain today as regards Spanish culture? Is there a...
Right. Of course, today, after the diplomatic relations were established between Spain and Israel, I can say in Western Europe, Spain is probably the most cordial of all countries. Somehow, I don't know how to explain it, there are good relations between Israel and Spain. There are various agreements between Spain and Israel on cultural level that allow people from Spain to come to Israel and people from Israel to go to Spain for research, and so on. Obviously in Spain there is great interest in the research of the Ladino literature, in Israel as well. So here of course there are grounds for collaboration, cooperation between experts from the two countries. Some of our top leaders, like one of the presidents, Yitzhak Navon, is a Ladino speaker, and obviously when he spoke, he knows also Spanish, but when they heard him speak in Ladino, they were very much impressed. There is a kind of a romantic and nostalgic attitude in some parts of Spain, particularly the vast, there are quite a number of places where Spaniards claim and believe that they are of Jewish origin. So that is the probable explanation for a certain philo-Semitism that is found in Spain, besides anti-Semitism, which is always there, thank God. But philo-Semitism that is found in Spain, which we do not find in France, in England, Germany. In Spain there is great sympathy. So there is a good reason to believe that such relations between Israel and Spain will facilitate further research in Ladino. Now, yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Why did they write in Ladino if they used the Rashi characters rather than biblical characters?
Yes. The use of the Rashi characters in all languages, including Ladino, including Yiddish and Judeo-Arabic, it is because it's easier. The reason why the Rashi characters developed, it was in order to write quicker. And the usual characters of the book are more difficult. And if you think about it, you will see there are straight lines and instead of roundish and so on. And it is a question of time. Some people think and claim that it is also to distinguish between the totally holy and the profane. I am not very sure that this is so, since the very religious commentaries of Rashi and others are found in this script. Next.
What's
please.
Rashi characters though, regarding her question?
Rashi characters are the characters like not this one, this Aleph. This is
Oh, the other Aleph.
is this not the one in Israel that is used for it. This is the Aleph in script. The Rashi script. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
You were talking about the Sephardim, when they went into the other countries, that they had an elite attitude.
Yes.
Was that due during the golden age of Spain, that the Jews had a lot to do with literary advancement and sciences, and was that part of the attitude, that they were literate compared to the other communities that they were entering, or was that part of it?
First of all, without saying anything about the level of the other Jews, it is an idea, it is an attitude that developed independent of anyone else, as you rightly said, already in Spain that they felt so. They always called themselves, first of all, the word Sepharad comes from the book of Obadiah, and there is verse 20, I believe, it's in one chapter, you can always check, it says, and the captivity of Jerusalem that is in Sepharad. Sepharad, it's been accepted as Spain. The captivity of Jerusalem, the elite of the Jerusalem aristocracy was driven away, so to speak, to Spain. And one of the chronicles that was written in 1492 is called Shevet Yehuda, the tribe of Judah. Whether they're right or wrong, the Jews of Spain considered themselves the aristocracy of the Jewish people. And usually there are, of course, people who think so they are not right, but this is what they felt, and this is what determined their history. And when they arrived, where they arrived, they looked really, they claimed that the pronunciation of Hebrew was the right one, their knowledge of grammar. Of course, as you suggested, in the Golden Age, what they achieved, they've always been very proud, and that determined, as you rightly said, their attitude towards the other Jews and the other people. Yes?
There's a town in Mexico called Pachuca, and this town consists of many Mexican, Indian, Jewish people, because during the Spanish Inquisition, the Jews from Spain came over to Mexico and mixed with the Indians there, and many of them were Spanish. And so you have like this tri-cultural ethnic group of people who are indigenous and also practice Judaism. And how would you classify the Jewish people in Peru or in Latin America? Like,
Are you
would
talking
call them-
about the Jews
would you call them Sephardic,
of
or
the
what would you
recent,
call them?
you mean the Jewish communities, or
Yeah.
openly Jewish, who are practicing Judaism in Peru, Argentina, and so on?
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Of course not, they are not Sephardi.
What-
Most of them, some of them are Sephardi, some of them are Ashkenazi. They're recent arrivals. The emigration to the United States was, in fact, there was a parallel immigration at the time to Argentina. There were immigrants to other parts of the New World, mostly from Eastern Europe, but some Sephardi Jews also settled in this part of the world. So they are either Sephardi or Ashkenazi. It's no longer the language that people speak that determines whether they are Sephardi or Ashkenazi, but it's their background and the way they feel, of course. And as for what your comment about the Indians and so on, of course, it is a well-known thing that the Inquisition continued to operate in the New World, and there were many who fled from the Iberian Peninsula and came to the New World, and as you know, the first communities, Jewish communities, to be established in the New World were all of ex-conversos who came back, who returned to Judaism in various parts of the New World. Yes, sir.
I have a question. The language of the Jews who went to Holland and then to the islands, they're Ladino?
No. That's why I emphasize the title of my lecture, the Oriental Eastern Sephardim. And that is because the Jews who arrived, I think we have to finish in 2 minutes.
I was coming to hear the end of it being released yesterday.
Oh.
That way, they said
I
you
thought
all was running late.
I thought I was going to repeat the whole lecture. You wanted only the end, so you got the end. No. Now, in answer to your question, the Jews who arrived in Amsterdam, in Bayonne, Bordeaux, Hamburg, London, and later on Sherit Israel, Curaçao, etc., in the Caribbean, are all descendants of conversos, of new Christians, who returned to Judaism, and therefore they spoke Spanish of the time of the 16th and 17th century Spain, or Portuguese of Portugal. And therefore they do not have any part in the development of Ladino. They used either Spanish or Portuguese, all right? And not Ladino. The last question, I think, yes?
If I understood you correctly, you said that Ladino used Hebrew characters in 1928?
Yes.
What happened in 1928?
In 1928, Mustafa Kemal, called Ataturk, the founder of New Turkey, decided to abandon the Arabic script of the Turkish language and introduce the Latin characters. And side by side with this, he forbade the use of Arabic characters. Side by side with this, for some reason, the Jews also decided to modernize Ladino, and they adopted the Latin character.